She was kicked out of home at 18, but her late father's inheritance changed everything. Sarah carried more than just documents in her worn leather bag. She carried 11 years of silence, sleepless nights, and questions no one had bothered to answer. She was 29 years old that day when she returned, and every step she took on the dirt road leading up to the old family property seemed to weigh twice as much as it should. It wasn't curiosity that had brought her back to that small town nestled in the Appalachians. It was a right that someone had been hiding from her for over a decade. It had all started 11 years earlier, during a week she could never fully forget, no matter how hard she tried. Her father, Arthur, had passed away unexpectedly at the beginning of winter, taking with him the only sense of security Sarah had ever known. The wake was quick, cold, full of people she barely recognized. And when the last guests left and the house fell silent, her stepmother Eleanor called her to sit in the main room. Sarah was 18. She was still wearing the dark dress from the wake, her eyes red, her hands trembling non-stop. She thought Eleanor wanted to talk about grief, about the coming days, about how they would get through that moment together. That's not what happened. Eleanor sat on the other side of the table, back straight, hands clasped on the wooden surface as if she were conducting a business meeting. Beside her, the eldest son, Tyler, 22, stood leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. The youngest daughter, Chloe, 16, sat on the farthest corner of the sofa, staring at the floor. "Sarah," Eleanor began in a voice that held no warmth, "I need to be direct with you because we don't have much time, and there are many things to settle. Your father left nothing registered in your name. The property, the land, everything here belongs to the family. And family in this case means my children." Sarah stared at her for a moment, not understanding. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely coming out. "There's no will, no document, nothing with your name on it." Eleanor said this with a chilling calm. "Your father and I discussed this many times. He understood that the assets should go to those who stayed here, taking care of everything. You're young. You'll rebuild your life. But there's no place for you here anymore." Tyler didn't say a word. He just looked at Sarah with that expression of someone who had already decided the matter was closed before it even began. Chloe kept her eyes on the floor, and that silence from the younger girl was the only thing that remained clearly etched in Sarah's memory, besides her stepmother's words. Sarah had no lawyer. She had no money to find one. There was no one in that house who would fight for her. Her father had been everything she had, and he had left without even a note. Or at least that's what she believed at that moment. She went to her room, opened the leather bag she used for school, and packed what fit. 2 changes of clothes, a photo of her mother who had passed away when she was 6, a small notebook of notes she had kept since she was 15, and the money she had saved by doing odd jobs in the neighborhood over the past few months. When she walked out the front door, no one went to the window to watch her leave. The dirt road stretched long and silent beneath her feet. The surrounding mountains were the same as always, tall, green, indifferent. The pine trees grew along the edges of the path as they always had, sharp and sturdy like sentinels that didn't care what happened between humans. Sarah didn't cry until she reached the bus stop in the center of the small town, and when the tears came, she allowed herself to cry for exactly as long as the drive to the nearest state capital took. After that, she tucked the tears away carefully and went to work. The years that followed weren't easy, but Sarah was made of a stubbornness that sometimes startled the people around her. She found work as a housekeeper for a family, slept in a small room out back, and sent part of her money to a savings account that grew slowly, penny by penny. She learned to sew by watching tutorials on TV and soon was mending clothes for the neighborhood women for a small but honest fee. When she had saved enough, she rented a simple room in a boarding house and started taking on more sewing clients. She didn't talk much about the past. When people asked where she was from, she'd say, "The Appalachians," and leave it at that. Not because she was ashamed, but because the whole story hurt in a way she still hadn't learned to carry well. There was a wound inside her that wouldn't heal, and she knew exactly its shape. The outline of an old house in the mountains, surrounded by pine trees, with a wooden gate that creaked when it opened. She made a few friends over the years, simple, honest people who worked hard and complained little. The owner of the boarding house, Martha, a woman in her early 60s, with her hair always in a bun and a printed apron she never took off, was the first person in many years to ask about Sarah's life with a genuine curiosity that held no malice. The two had coffee together every morning before the rest of the boarding house woke up, and it was in those quiet coffees that Sarah slowly learned to talk about what she had lost. "You never went back?" Martha asked one of those mornings, after Sarah had told her story for the first time, briefly, almost without emotion. "No. No reason to go back," Sarah answered without hesitation. "But you think about it, it wasn't a question." Martha had a way of stating things people hadn't yet said out loud. "I do," Sarah admitted, holding the mug with both hands. "Not for the property, for the feeling of being thrown out of my home like I was worth nothing." Martha was quiet for a moment, then said in that calm voice of hers, "Someday it'll work itself out. Unjust things rarely stay buried forever." Sarah had smiled with a politeness that meant she didn't believe it, but she was grateful for the sentiment. The letter arrived on an afternoon in September, 4 years after that conversation. Sarah was in her room hemming a piece of clothing when she heard Martha knock on the door with 3 short taps, the signal they had agreed on for mail. "It came from the Appalachians," Martha said, holding out the envelope with an expression Sarah couldn't read at first. The envelope was made of thick paper, slightly yellowed, with Sarah's name written by hand in careful lettering. The return address was a county clerk's office in a small town she knew well, the same one a few miles from the family property. The clerk who signed the letter was named Silas Fletcher. Sarah opened the envelope with fingers that didn't tremble as much as they had at 18, but still trembled a little. The letter was formal, direct, and short. It informed her that during a renovation of the county clerk's office, a copy of a document registered over 11 years ago in the name of Arthur Mitchell, Sarah's father, had been found. The document was a will. Sarah was listed as the sole legitimate heir to all assets registered in her father's name, including the rural property known as Mitchell Farm, located in the mountain region of the county. The county clerk requested that Sarah get in touch to proceed with the legal steps. She read the letter 3 times in a row. Then she sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, the paper in her hands, her eyes fixed on the wall, seeing nothing. Martha had stood in the doorway, waiting. "She knew," Sarah said in a low, cold voice. "Eleanor knew about the will from the start, and she lied to my face." Martha entered the room, sat in the chair by the window, and stayed quiet, which was exactly what Sarah needed at that moment. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us beginners. Now, continuing. The phone call with County Clerk Silas happened the next day in a phone booth near the boarding house because Sarah's cell phone had broken the week before and she hadn't replaced it yet. Silas was a man with a measured voice, the kind who weighs his words before letting them out, and he carefully explained what he had found. "I'm new in the position," he said. "I took office about 4 months ago. When the order came to reorganize the archive, I personally supervised to make sure nothing important was thrown away. And that's when I found a copy of your father's will at the bottom of a box that was behind an old cabinet. It had Arthur Mitchell's name on the cover, and inside everything was properly recorded. Date, signatures, witnesses." "And the original?" Sarah asked. Silas paused a second before answering. "The original isn't in the records. There's a blank space where the protocol number should be, which is very irregular, the kind of thing that indicates the document was intentionally removed from the system." Sarah gripped the phone tighter. "Someone made the original disappear. That's what the records suggest. I can't say for sure who or how because it happened before my tenure, but the copy I found has legal validity. The problem is it can be contested, and if there's a contestation, you'll need additional evidence to support your position. It was a long road. It was complicated, but it was a road." Sarah thanked him, hung up the phone and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the sun beating on her back. Then she went to the boarding house, opened the suitcase that was on top of the wardrobe, folded the yellow dress that was at the bottom, slung the leather bag over her shoulder, and began planning the trip back. Martha didn't try to dissuade her. She just made a grilled cheese for the road and said, as Sarah waited for the bus on the sidewalk in front of the boarding house, "Go with your head held high. Don't lower your chin for anyone." "I never have," Sarah answered, with a hint of a smile that reached her eyes for the first time in a long while. The bus traveled the winding roads for almost 4 hours before reaching the municipality. Sarah spent most of the trip with her face turned to the window, watching the mountains gradually appear on the horizon, first as distant shadows, then as solid, imposing presences that seemed to grow as the bus moved forward. The sky was an intense blue, with high white clouds moving slowly over the peaks. There was something painful and yet familiar about all that green. The smell of damp earth coming through the cracks in the window. The way the sunlight hit differently there, more direct, warmer on the skin. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment and realized that, beneath everything she felt, there was something she hadn't expected to find. Longing. Not longing for her stepmother, not longing for Tyler or the things she had lost. Longing for the place. Of the mornings with her father on the porch, the sound of wind through the leaves of the cornstalks he grew in the backyard, the smell of coffee that filled the whole house early in the morning. Arthur was a simple man, a man of few words, but he had loved his daughter the only way he knew how, with presence and quiet devotion. The memory hurt, as it always did, but this time Sarah didn't push it aside. She let it hurt. She would need everything she carried inside to face what lay ahead. The center of the small town was practically the same. A few new storefronts, a couple of businesses that hadn't been there before, but the town square was the same, with the gazebo in the middle and the concrete benches under the big trees. Sarah went straight to the county clerk's office, which was on a street parallel to the main square, in a brick building with a simple sign on the door. Silas was a man in his 40s with grey hair at the temples, thick-rimmed glasses, and a careful way of moving that matched the measured voice she remembered from the phone. He received her with respectful seriousness, had her sit down, brought the copy of the will in a clear folder, and placed it on the table with care, as if it were something fragile. "Here it is," he said, sliding the folder toward her. "Everything is in order. Your father's signature, the date, 2 witnesses, but as I said, without the original and without the witnesses who can confirm they were present at the act, the opposing side can contest it." "Who were the witnesses?" Sarah asked, looking at the document. "2 names. The first is a man who, according to municipal records, moved away from the area over 6 years ago. The second is a woman named Evelyn Reed." Sarah looked up from the paper. "Mrs. Evelyn. You know her?" "She was my mother's best friend," Sarah answered, her voice growing smaller. "She lived on the property next to ours." She was quiet for a second, processing. Mrs. Evelyn had witnessed the will. She had been present at the county clerk's office with Sarah's father, and for more than 11 years she had stayed silent. There was a reason for that silence, and Sarah needed to find out what it was before anything else. She left the county clerk's office with the folder under her arm and her leather bag over her shoulder. The dirt road that led to the Mitchell farm climbed through the hills for about a mile past the center, and Sarah walked that path on foot, as she had done so many times in childhood. The pine trees grew along the edges, their pointed leaves reaching toward the sky. The stones on the road were covered with moss in the damp corners. The air had that particular smell of earth and brush and sawdust that she had carried in her memory all those years without realizing it. When the property appeared at the end of the curve, Sarah stopped. The Mitchell farm had turned into something else. The wooden gate was fastened with a rusty chain that creaked in the wind. The fences that marked the boundaries of the land were down in several places. The vegetation had taken over everything, with a determination that seemed deliberate. Vines covered almost the entire stone house's facade, growing through the window cracks, climbing up the roof. The garden Arthur had tended with such care had become a tangle of tall weeds and invasive shrubs. The herb beds that used to sit to the left of the entrance were unrecognizable, but the house was still standing. And the gate still had the same iron latch that Sarah had learned to open with a specific wrist motion when she was about 8 years old. She stood at the edge of the road for a long moment, looking at that property that had been taken from her 11 years ago. There was a strange ache in all that abandonment. It wasn't exactly anger, though anger was there too. It was a deeper sadness, the kind that comes when you see something good being wasted through carelessness or indifference. Eleanor had kept the property registered in her name all these years. She hadn't sold it, hadn't built anything, hadn't done anything. She had simply let it rot, as if the only goal was to make sure Sarah didn't have it. The neighboring property, separated by an old wire fence, belonged to Mrs. Evelyn. That one was clearly lived in. Windows open, a clothesline with laundry, an old dog lying in the shade near the door. Sarah took a deep breath and walked over. She knocked on the door with 3 firm raps. She waited. It took a little longer than she expected, and Sarah was thinking of knocking again when the door opened. Mrs. Evelyn had gotten old. It wasn't the gentlest word, but it was the most honest. The woman Sarah remembered had dark hair tied in a braid, a loud, easy laugh, and a way of walking that seemed never in a hurry. The Evelyn who opened the door was a woman in her 70s, hair completely white, back a little hunched, hands marked by time. But her eyes were the same, brown, sharp, able to see beyond what people showed. They looked at each other for a moment in silence. Then Mrs. Evelyn put her hand to her mouth and closed her eyes for an instant, as if holding back something that was about to spill over. "Sarah," she said in a voice that came out small. "Mrs. Evelyn." Sarah replied with a calm that took effort to maintain. The elderly woman opened the door wider, gestured with her head for her to come in, and walked slowly toward the kitchen without saying another word. Sarah entered. Mrs. Evelyn's house smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke, a smell that Sarah's memory associated with childhood. With the afternoons, her mother brought her to visit her friend, while the 2 old folks talked on the porch. The kitchen was small, clean, with a 4-burner stove and a table covered with a slightly worn floral cloth. There was a lucky horseshoe hanging above the window, as there always was. Mrs. Evelyn put a pot on the stove without saying anything. Sarah sat in her usual chair on the left side of the table, with its back to the window, and waited. "You went to get the will," Mrs. Evelyn said with her back to her, stirring the coffee. "I did," Sarah replied. "I heard a new clerk had come to the county clerk's office and had gone through the files." The old woman turned with 2 cups in her hands and set them carefully on the table. "I was waiting for the moment you'd show up here." "Why didn't you come to me?" Sarah asked. The question came out direct, without accusation, but also without softness. "You were there when my father registered the will. You knew it existed." Mrs. Evelyn sat on the other side of the table and wrapped her hands around the cup before answering. She took a time that seemed long. "Sarah, when your stepmother found out you had left, she came here." Her voice came out firm but low. "She came with Tyler. He came with... said that if I opened my mouth about the will or anything related to Arthur's assets, she would make my life very difficult. She didn't specify how, but Eleanor has a way of threatening that needs no explanation. And I was old, alone, with health that wasn't the best. I was afraid." Sarah stared at the cup in front of her. "And the man who worked at the county clerk's office back then? The one who made the original disappear?" Mrs. Evelyn sighed deeply. "I don't know his name, but I know Eleanor paid him. Your father told me before he passed that she had tried to convince him not to register the will, and when she saw he was going to do it anyway, she started looking for other ways out. Your father didn't know she had reached the county clerk's office, but I suspected it at the time. I just had no way to prove it." "And you left town soon after?" "Soon after, yes. Maybe by coincidence, maybe not." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken things. Sarah took a sip of hot coffee and kept her gaze on the window, on the mountains visible in the distance over the wire fence. "Mrs. Evelyn," she said finally, "I need witnesses. Witnesses who can confirm that the will is legitimate and that my father was of sound mind when he registered it. You were there." Mrs. Evelyn lifted her eyes from the cup and stared at Sarah for a long moment. "I know," she said, "and I should have spoken up sooner. I shouldn't have waited 11 years to do the right thing." She paused. "But if you want me to testify, I will testify." At this point, I've got nothing left to lose. And a debt to your mother and father is a debt that never expires. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, it was still too early for that, but a knot that had been tight ever since the letter from the county clerk's office arrived eased a little. There's one more thing. Mrs. Evelyn stood up slowly, went to the pantry next to the kitchen and stayed there for a moment. When she returned, she was holding an envelope different from the one Sarah had received from the county clerk's office. This one was older, the paper slightly yellowed. Sarah's name written in the center in handwriting she recognized immediately. It was her father's handwriting. Mrs. Evelyn placed the envelope on the table with a care that seemed ceremonial. "Your father gave this to me a few days before he passed," she said. "He said only one thing: open it if she ever comes back. I waited so long, I started to think you'd never show up." Sarah stared at the envelope without touching it for a long moment. The name written in her father's hand, the handwriting a little shaky, as it had been in his final months when he wasn't doing well. She reached out and picked up the envelope carefully. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves along the wire fence, and Mrs. Evelyn's old dog barked once softly at nothing. Sarah opened the envelope with a careful motion, as if afraid to tear something that couldn't be fixed. The paper, folded in three, came out easily, and she spread it open on the table. It was a long letter. Her father's handwriting, which she had learned to recognize from grocery lists stuck on the fridge and notes left under her plate when he left early, filled almost 3 pages of notebook paper, front and back. She began to read with her coffee forgotten on the corner of the table, and Mrs. Evelyn silent on the other side, eyes downcast, giving her privacy without leaving the room. The letter started simply. "My Sarah, if you're reading this, it's because Evelyn kept it safe and you had the courage to come back. I already know you came back, because you were never the type to give up. You got that from your mother." Sarah stopped reading for a second, took a deep breath, continued. Her father wrote in his usual straightforward language. No frills, no beating around the bush. He explained that he had registered the will because he had suspected Eleanor's intentions for some time, that he had realized she had a way of operating that needed documentation to be contained, that the property had belonged to Sarah's maternal grandparents, that it had been passed to Arthur, with the implicit condition that one day it would come to their daughter. "This land has your mother's blood in it," he wrote. "She asked me before she left to take care of it for you. I couldn't do much while I was alive, because my health went faster than I expected, and Eleanor knows how to use people's silence as a weapon. But I did what I could at the county clerk's office. I hope it's enough." There was a passage about Camilla, Eleanor's youngest daughter. "The younger girl has no malice. She looks at my daughter with a look that tells me she suffers from what her mother does, but she doesn't have the strength to oppose it. If you ever get a chance to get close to her, approach carefully. There are things people keep, waiting for someone they can trust." Sarah read that passage twice, and there was, at the end of the letter, a sentence that made her stop reading for a much longer time. "I've asked for your forgiveness in my thoughts every day since you left. I didn't know how to protect you like I should have, but I know you're strong enough not to need my protection. You always were. Forgive a father who made mistakes out of fear, but who never stopped loving you." Sarah folded the letter, put it back inside the envelope, and held it between her palms for a time she couldn't measure. Outside, the wind in the Appalachians made that specific sound she had forgotten existed, a kind of long whisper that passed through the pine trees and faded down the hillside. "He knew Eleanor would try something," she said finally, more to herself than to Mrs. Evelyn. "He knew," the old woman confirmed softly. "Your father was quiet, but he wasn't naive." Sarah carefully put the envelope in her bag and sat in silence for another moment before standing up. "I need to go talk to her." "To Eleanor?" "To Eleanor." Mrs. Evelyn looked at her with that expression of someone who wants to say something but is weighing whether she should. "Be careful, Sarah. She won't take it well." "I know," Sarah said, picking up her bag, "but she'll have to take it anyway." The main house of Mitchell Farm was about 300 yards from the gate, beyond the rusty iron gate. Sarah pushed the gate open with her shoulder, after loosening the chain that was only looped through but not locked, and walked along the stone path that had been the trail of her childhood. The weeds had grown over almost everything, but the house's structure was solid. The stone and lime walls held up well, and the veranda her father had built with hardwood resisted time with a stooped dignity. The front door was closed. Sarah knocked. Over a minute passed before the door opened. Eleanor hadn't aged the same way Mrs. Evelyn had. She was a woman in her mid-50s, still with an upright posture, hair with recent highlights, clothes that showed a care for appearance that contrasted with the state of the property around her. Her eyes were the same as Sarah remembered, bright, calculating, always assessing. For a second, neither of them said anything. Then Eleanor cracked a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sarah," she said, as if it were no surprise, "I heard a new county clerk had arrived. I was waiting." "May I come in?" Sarah asked. Of course, Eleanor opened the door wider. "This is still my house." For now, Sarah thought, but didn't say. The main living room was different from her memory, but not unrecognizable. Eleanor had swapped out some furniture, painted the walls a lighter color, put up new curtains. But the floor was the same, darkened, worn wooden planks, and the fireplace in the corner was the same one her father used to light in winter. Tyler was standing by the window, arms crossed, just as he had been 11 years before. Chloe was sitting on the sofa, eyes cast down, just as she had been 11 years before. That symmetry left Sarah feeling strange for a second. "Sit," Eleanor pointed to a chair. She herself remained standing, a position of advantage. "You came because of the document the county clerk found." "I came," Sarah said, sitting down. "And I came because I want to settle this without making it more complicated than it already is." "There's nothing to settle," Eleanor said with that irritating calm. "That document has serious irregularities. The original was never properly filed, which raises doubts about its validity. And you're going to need to prove a lot before any judge recognizes the copy as sufficient." "I have a witness," Sarah said. "Who was present at the county clerk's office when my father registered it?" Something quickly passed over Eleanor's face. It wasn't quite panic, but it was close. "Any witness you bring is going to be someone who hasn't seen anything in the last 11 years, she said, adjusting her tone. "Besides, there are questions about your father's health in the months before he left. He wasn't well, Sarah. He was taking medication that can affect judgment. We have medical documentation to prove it." Sarah stood still. "You're going to use my father's health as an argument to invalidate his last wishes." "I'm saying there are legitimate questions about his cognitive state at the time," Eleanor replied with a coldness that only someone who had practiced a lot can maintain. "Tyler and I will formally contest the will. It's going to be a long, expensive, and exhausting process. Wouldn't it be simpler for you to accept what I offer amicably?" "How much?" Sarah asked, not because she was going to accept, but because she wanted to hear the number. Eleanor said an amount that was an insult. Sarah stood up. "No," she said with a simplicity that needed no elaboration. As she turned to leave, she saw out of the corner of her eye that Chloe had lifted her eyes from the ground for the first time since Sarah had entered. The two looked at each other for a second. There was something in that look that Sarah couldn't name yet, but she filed it away. She left the house without saying goodbye. In the days that followed, Sarah stayed in a rented room in the center of the small town, a simple room with a window facing the street, and she went door to door trying to gather more testimonies from people who had known her father and could confirm that he was lucid and capable in the months leading up to the registration of the will. And then she hit the first big obstacle. Eleanor had spent the last 11 years carefully cultivating her own image. She was an active member of the neighborhood association, helped organize the annual festivals, had friends in all the important groups of the community. And the version she had spread about Sarah over the years had taken deep roots, that the stepdaughter had abandoned her sick father to seek a better life in the city, that she had shown herself ungrateful and uninterested until Arthur's last days. When Sarah knocked on doors asking for support or statements, most people shied away. Some said they didn't want to get involved in family matters. Others said with an awkwardness she recognized as shame that they had already given a statement to the other side. One woman, who had been a close friend of Arthur, simply closed the door in Sarah's face without saying a word. It was like trying to walk in quicksand. With every step Sarah took forward, the ground gave way a little more. One night, back in the rented room, She sat on the edge of the bed with papers scattered around, and a tiredness that went beyond the physical. Her father's letter was in the transparent folder on the table. She looked at it for a while without opening it. "You were never the type to give up." Her father's words came without her needing to open the envelope. She knew the passage by heart. Sarah got up, washed her face in the small bathroom sink, and returned to the papers with renewed concentration. There were other ways to prove her father's lucidity. There were people who no longer lived in the small town, but could be located. There was Silas himself, who could testify about the irregular procedures in the records. And there was, above all, that look from Chloe that Sarah couldn't stop thinking about. The next day, she went to the county clerk's office to speak with Silas. "The medical report that Eleanor is going to present," she said. "Can it be contested?" Silas adjusted his glasses and chose his words carefully, as always. "It can if you have testimony from people who lived with your father at the time and can say they knew him as a person of sound mind. The problem is the credibility of those witnesses compared to the other sides." "And what if I can prove the original will was intentionally removed from the archives?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "That would change things quite a bit, because it would indicate there was deliberate interference with the documents, which casts a different light on the contest. But to prove that, you'd need someone who knows how it was done." Sarah stared at him. "Where did the clerk who was here before go to work after he left?" Silas opened a file, flipped through a few pages. "He requested a transfer to another county," he said. "He stayed there for about 3 years and then resigned. According to the records, he went back to his family's hometown." "What town is that?" Silas hesitated. "That information is in the personnel files, which aren't open to public access, but—" He paused deliberately. "I can say the name of the town is mentioned in a letter that arrived here last year about closing out his registration." It wasn't a direct answer, but it was enough. Sarah wrote down what she needed. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out." Now continuing. 3 days of waiting for a reply to a letter Sarah had sent, because the address she had was a postal one with no phone number attached. Days she used to visit Mitchell Farm for the second time, this time entering through the back porch, which wasn't locked. The inside of the house was in better shape than the outside suggested. There had been rain, but the roof had been repaired at some point recently, and the rooms, though covered in dust and with some furniture draped in white sheets, kept the structure intact. Sarah's room still had the same wooden shelves her father had put up for her when she was 12, asking for help to store the books she collected from used bookstores and thrift shops. She stood in the doorway of the room for a long time. There was a book still on the shelf, one she had forgotten when she left in a hurry. Blue cover, faded title. She picked it up, leafed through it distractedly, and found in the middle of the pages a note she had written to herself when she was about 15, in that round teenage handwriting, saying, "One day I'll have a house with a garden and a fruit tree and an old cat." Sarah folded the note, put it in the pocket of her yellow dress, and left before the emotion became too big to contain. On the night of the 3rd day of waiting, there was a quiet knock on the door of the boarding house room. Sarah opened it, expecting the landlady. It was Chloe. The woman was older than the silent teenager Sarah had seen on both sides of a difficult table. She was 27, with short hair and a direct gaze that revealed someone who had been through things that had hardened her from the inside out. She was holding a cloth bag and had the expression of someone who had taken a long detour before arriving where she was. "Can I come in?" she asked in a low voice. Sarah stepped back from the door to make room. Chloe entered, stood in the middle of the room, seeming to evaluate where to start. She had a restless way about her that matched how she'd shown up without warning. "I didn't come because of my mother," she said first, making it clear. "I know," Sarah replied. "I never agreed with what she did. When you left that day, I was 16 and I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't say anything. I kept that to myself for years." "Why now?" Sarah asked without harshness. Chloe placed the cloth bag on the bed and pulled out a cell phone. She stared at the screen for a second as if making one last decision, then turned to Sarah. "Last week my mother called a meeting at home. She wanted me to sign a statement saying I remembered episodes where your father was confused, didn't recognize people, said things that made no sense. She wanted to use that to support the medical report she got. She got a doctor to sign a fake report, a man who's known her for years. He signed saying your father had cognitive changes in the months before he left. Chloe paused. I refused to sign the statement. I said I wasn't going to lie about that. My mother got furious. She started screaming, saying I was betraying the family. Sarah stared at her, waiting. Chloe unlocked the phone and opened an audio file. During the fight, the phone was in my coat pocket and accidentally recorded. It lasted about 8 minutes. In the middle of the recording, my mother plainly says she knew about the will from the beginning. She paused. And she names the employee who was paid to make the original disappear. The silence that followed was as thick as a wall. Sarah stared at the phone Chloe held out. The audio was the piece that solved everything. With it, there was no possible challenge, because it was Eleanor herself confirming what she had done. It was the end of the lawsuit. The will would be recognized. The property would return to Sarah. But there was a problem that Sarah felt in her chest, even before she put it into words. Using that audio meant exposing Chloe. The young woman had accidentally recorded her own mother, but formally presenting the recording would publicly declare that the daughter had turned in the mother. And Eleanor was not the kind of person who forgave that. Chloe would be cut off from the family with a ferocity Sarah knew well, because she had gone through the same thing. She was silent for a moment. "You know what will happen if I use this," she said. Chloe nodded with a calm that made it clear she had thought about it long enough. "I know, but I can't carry the weight anymore of being an accomplice to an injustice that happened before I was old enough to understand what it was. I was 16 when you left. I couldn't do anything. I'm 27 now, I can. Your mother won't forgive you." "Mother," Sarah said. "My mother never really saw me as a daughter. I was always a tool." Chloe said this without bitterness, just with the precision of someone who had reached a conclusion after a long time thinking. "You're going to use that audio, and you're going to get back what's yours. And I'll be able to sleep without waking up in the middle of the night thinking I'm just like her." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. There was a part of her that wanted to ask if Chloe was sure, that wanted to give her an out, that wanted to protect that young woman from the pain about to fall on her. But she knew from her own experience that people of 27 who reach a decision after carrying guilt for 11 years don't need more time. They need someone who takes them seriously. "All right," Sarah said, "but I'll present it in a way that protects you as much as possible. Your name doesn't have to be the one that comes first. Let me talk to Silas about how to do this." Chloe nodded. There was a subtle relief on her face that Sarah recognized. It was the relief of someone finally doing what they should have done a long time ago. "There's one more thing," Chloe said, still standing in the middle of the room. "The doctor who signed the report, my mother paid him under the table, but he signed with his official stamp. If you want to challenge the document, you'll need to prove it was coerced or paid for. And he lives here in town. He didn't leave." Sarah processed that information. "And you think he'd talk?" Chloe thought for a second. "I think the weight of his conscience is already heavy. He has kids in town. He has a reputation he's built over years. If someone gets to him with my mother's audio and shows him the other side has enough evidence anyway, he might prefer to walk out the front door before the story comes out in a way that hurts him even more." It was a strategy. Not guaranteed, but plausible. Sarah picked up the cloth bag that Chloe had left on the bed. Inside was a copy of the audio on a flash drive, the statement Chloe had refused to sign with the notes next to it, showing exactly what her mother had asked for, and an old photo Sarah hadn't expected to find. Herself, about 12 years old, sitting in the garden at Mitchell Farm with Arthur beside her, both looking at the camera with identical smiles. Sarah stared at the photo for a while. Chloe had kept that photo for over 10 years. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice coming out smaller than she'd intended. "I found it at the bottom of a drawer after my mother packed up everything that belonged to your father," Chloe said from the door. "I kept it because it felt wrong to throw it away." After Chloe left, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed with the photo in her hands and the flash drive on the table beside her. The room was silent. Outside, the small-town night was quiet, the kind of silence the state capital never had, that living silence of the Appalachians with crickets and wind and nothing else. She stayed up late, not from anxiety, but thinking. There was a difference between the two kinds of insomnia, and she knew it well. The next morning she went to the office of the doctor who had signed the report. The reception area was simple, with 2 plastic chairs and a corner plant that needed water. The receptionist, a young woman who looked at Sarah with barely disguised curiosity, said the doctor only saw patients by appointment. "Tell him Sarah Mitchell is here, and that it's about the report he signed at Eleanor Vance's request." The receptionist blinked, got up and went to the back room. She stayed there longer than necessary to deliver a message. When she came back, there was something in her expression Sarah couldn't define. "The doctor will see you." The office was small, with a dark wood desk, diplomas on the walls, and a window overlooking the backyard. The doctor was a man around 60, white hair, the kind of person who had spent his whole life in that town and had the face to show for it. He was sitting when Sarah entered, and he stayed sitting, which was the opposite of standing to greet her. Sarah sat in the chair across from the desk, without waiting to be invited. "You came to threaten me," he said directly. "No, I came to talk." Sarah placed the flash drive on the desk between them. On this flash drive is a recording in which Eleanor Vance describes the arrangements she made to contest my father's will, including the report you signed. The doctor stared at the flash drive. A recording can be questioned. It can, but together with the testimony of Mrs. Evelyn Reed, who was present at the county clerk's office when the will was registered, and can confirm that my father was of sound mind, and with the irregularities in the clerk's records that the current notary is already documenting, your report is going to look exactly like what it is. Silence. "I'm not asking you to do anything," Sarah continued. "I'm telling you I have enough evidence to move forward either way. What you want to do with that information is your choice." She stood up, picked up the flash drive, and headed for the door. "Wait." The word came out quietly, but she stopped. She said it was a matter of protecting the family, that your father wasn't in any condition, and that this was the right thing to do. The doctor's voice was that of someone searching for an excuse that had grown too small over time. "I let myself be convinced. It wasn't for the money. It was because I'd known her for many years and wanted to believe she was honest." Sarah stood still, her back to him, for a second. "You know what she asked wasn't honest," she said, without turning around, "and you know what you need to do." She left without waiting for a reply. Silas received Sarah that same afternoon with a seriousness she had learned to interpret as his way of processing heavy matters. She presented the flash drive, explained the recording, explained where it came from and how it had reached her without mentioning Chloe's name directly. "This is substantial," he said after listening. "Very substantial. But before anything else, we need a formal meeting with all parties involved. It's the proper procedure." "When?" "I can schedule it for 4 days from now. That gives me time to properly formalize the documents and ensure the process follows the rules." 4 days. Sarah spent those 4 days doing things that helped her avoid thinking about what was to come. She visited Mrs. Evelyn every afternoon, helped the old lady tidy up the backyard, which had gotten a bit neglected due to a twisted ankle. She listened to stories about her mother that she had never heard before, because Mrs. Evelyn kept a vast collection of memories about the friendship between the two women who had been best friends since childhood. "Your mother had a gift for making people feel seen," Mrs. Evelyn said one afternoon as the two drank tea on the porch. "She'd walk into a room and you'd feel like she was genuinely paying attention to you. Not that kind of attention people pretend to give to be polite, real attention." Sarah stared at the mountains. "I miss someone I never really got to know." "You did know her. You were 6 years old, but you knew her. Some things stick even when you don't remember how." Mrs. Evelyn paused. "You have her smile when you're in a good mood. Not too different from that serious face you used to protect yourself." Sarah didn't answer, but she held the tea, warming her hands longer than necessary. On the 3rd day, the doctor sent a letter to the county clerk's office. Silas read it to Sarah over the phone, with a professional calm that didn't entirely hide the satisfaction of someone watching an injustice begin to unravel. In the letter, The doctor stated that he had signed the report based on verbal accounts from third parties without a proper clinical examination, and that he was reconsidering the validity of the document in light of additional information he had received. It wasn't a full confession, but it was enough to deflate the main argument of Eleanor's challenge. "She'll know it was the doctor," Sarah said. "Probably," Silas agreed, "but that's her problem now, not yours." On the fourth day, the meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning. Sarah arrived first, as always, with Mrs. Evelyn at her side holding her arm, not out of physical need but out of solidarity. The meeting room at the county clerk's office was small, with a long table, chairs around it, and a window overlooking the street. Eleanor arrived 15 minutes later with Tyler beside her. She was dressed in a way Sarah recognized as the clothes her stepmother wore when she wanted to project authority, formal attire in a setting that didn't call for it. Tyler seemed more tense than last time, jaw clenched, eyes that wouldn't stay still. Chloe was not present. Silas waited for everyone to sit down before beginning. "We are here to discuss the validity of the will registered by Arthur Mitchell on the date stated in the document, with his daughter Sarah Mitchell as the sole heir." He began with that voice that weighed every word. "Objections have been raised by the opposing party. We will address each one of them." Eleanor tried to take the floor before Silas finished. "Mr. Silas, I've already made it clear that there are serious irregularities in this document, and that the deceased's state of health during the period in question—" "You'll have to wait your turn, Mrs. Eleanor," Silas said with a courtesy that was, at the same time, a non-negotiable line. "This is not an open debate." Eleanor fell silent. Silas first presented the documents regarding the irregularities in the county clerk's office records, the blank space where the original protocol should have been, the timeline showing when the document had disappeared from the system, the correspondence he had located about the employee who had requested a transfer shortly after. He then presented the formal sworn statement from Mrs. Evelyn, which had been taken in writing in the previous days, confirming that she had been present at the clerk's office alongside Arthur on the day of the registration, and that the man was in full possession of his faculties, articulate, and aware of what he was signing. He presented the doctor's declaration withdrawing the medical report, and then he played the audio. He had taken care to talk to Chloe about how to present the recording in a way that protected the identity of whoever had recorded the excerpt. What was presented in the meeting was described as a recording obtained in the context of a family discussion, without the participants knowing they were being recorded, which was legally valid in certain contexts, and Silas had consulted a colleague to confirm. When the audio started playing, the room fell silent. Eleanor's voice came out clearly from the device. Recognizable, unmistakable. She said she had known about the will since before the wake, that she had taken steps to ensure the document would not be found. She named the employee she had paid. She said, with a chilling casualness, that her stepdaughter would never be able to prove anything because there's no one on her side here. Tyler stood motionless beside his mother. Eleanor, for the first time in all the years Sarah had known her, had nothing to say. Silas stopped the audio. The room fell silent for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then Tyler stood up. He didn't say anything. He walked to the door, opened it, and left. His footsteps echoed down the marble hallway of the clerk's office until they faded. Eleanor sat still in her chair, staring at the table, with the expression of someone who has just had the ground pulled out from under her feet. She had aged 10 years in those last few minutes, or maybe what had happened was that the armor had fallen off and revealed what was underneath. "Mrs. Eleanor," Silas said with a courtesy that didn't change in tone, "there are still other procedural points to address, but I want to ask you directly. Do you wish to continue contesting the will, or would you prefer to end the process here?" Eleanor was quiet for a time that no one filled. "Give me a week," she said at last, in a voice that had lost all its former firmness. "To talk to my children." Silas nodded. "I'll note that. Meeting adjourned for today." Sarah left the clerk's office with Mrs. Evelyn still holding her arm. The sunlight felt different outside, stronger, more direct. The street was as always, with people passing by, the distant noise of the market, the the smell of bread coming from some bakery she still hadn't figured out where it was. "How are you?" Mrs. Evelyn asked when they stopped on the sidewalk. Sarah thought about the real question before answering. "Relieved," she said, "afraid of what comes next, but relieved." "The fear after relief is the sign that you believe you're going to win," Mrs. Evelyn said, with that wisdom that didn't quite work as a proverb, but was spot on when she said it. Sarah almost smiled. 4 days later, Tyler showed up at the county clerk's office alone without warning while Sarah wasn't there. Silas called her right after to tell her. He filed a voluntary declaration, the notary said on the phone, confirming that he was aware of the existence of the will since his father's departure and confirming the facts described in the audio regarding his mother's actions. He said he wanted to close the matter. Sarah was quiet for a second. "Why did he do that?" "I don't know. He didn't give me any explanation beyond the document, but his declaration is substantial. With it, any challenge is definitively dismissed." There was something in that gesture from Tyler that Sarah hadn't expected. She had expected resistance until the end, had prepared herself for a long process. She hadn't prepared for the possibility that he might reach a point of saturation and choose to leave in a different way than the one he had entered. She thought about that for a while. She thought about how people carry burdens they never asked to carry. She thought about Chloe, who had kept the photo for years. She thought about Tyler, who had stood with his arms crossed his whole life beside a mother who controlled him, and who had reached a point where he couldn't take it anymore. It wasn't forgiveness. It was still too early for that, and maybe it never would be. But it was understanding that people's stories are rarely as simple as they seem from the outside. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to hit like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us, who are just starting out. Now continuing. The process was formally closed the following week. Eleanor didn't show up at the county clerk's office. Tyler had said she had decided to accept the outcome and would be moving to another town soon. Sarah received the keys to Mitchell Farm on a morning when the sun was already high, and the mountains had that intense blue that the winter sky sometimes produced in that region. Silas handed her the key ring with a respectful seriousness and added, unprompted, "Your father was a man who thought ahead. Too bad he didn't live to see it." Sarah closed her hand around the keys. The metal was cold. "He saw it," she said. "In some way, he saw it." Mrs. Evelyn was waiting at the entrance to the property, sitting on a wooden stump that had appeared there years ago and no one knew exactly when. The old woman's elderly dog had come along and was lying in the shadow of the fence. When Sarah arrived with the keys in hand, the old woman stood up with an agility that contradicted the curve of her back. "Open it," Mrs. Evelyn said simply. Sarah put the key into the rusty padlock on the gate, which gave way more easily than she expected. The wooden gate swung open with that familiar creak, and the two women walked through onto the overgrown stone path. The house ahead, with the vines embracing the stone walls and the roof darkened by time, seemed to have two faces at once, one of abandonment and one of endurance. The walls had withstood more than 11 years without care and were still standing. There was something in that Sarah felt as a message, but not the kind that came from anywhere supernatural, just the kind that comes when you project onto places what you already feel inside. She opened the front door with the right key on the third try. The inside smelled of damp earth, old mildew and wood that holds memory. The light streamed in through the door along with them, illuminating the dust suspended in the air, floating like confetti in slow motion. Sarah stood still in the middle of the living room for a long moment. It was the same room, the same hardwood floors, now darkened with dust, the fireplace in the corner with old ashes, the shelf that her father had built on the wall next to the window, still holding 2 empty vases that Sarah remembered seeing with flowers, the window overlooking the garden, now a green curtain of dense vegetation. Mrs. Evelyn stood nearby, respecting the silence. "It's going to be a lot of work," Sarah said finally. "It is," Mrs. Evelyn agreed, "but it's still standing." "It is." Sarah went to the window, unlatched the lock, and pushed. The wooden shutter gave way with effort, releasing a cloud of dust, but it opened. The fresh mountain air rushed in, along with the distant sound of birds and the smell of wet earth from the garden. It was a start. In the days that followed, Sarah learned the true state of the property with the patience of someone who isn't in a hurry because she had waited a long time for this. The main structure was sound. The roof had been repaired unevenly in some spots, but nothing that couldn't be fixed. The water well worked, the electrical system needed to be redone. The garden was a huge task, but a garden was something that grew in response to care, and she knew how to give care. She started with the back porch, which had been her father's favorite spot. She pulled the weeds by hand for an entire afternoon, using the rubber gloves she'd bought at the market. She cleaned the stone floor, which had come loose in some places. She painted the balustrade with the leftover white paint she'd found in a pantry cabinet. When she finished, at the end of the afternoon, with the mountain light falling golden on the clean porch, she sat in the same spot where her father used to sit. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry while she worked, but sitting there at the end of the day, with her hands aching and the porch smelling of paint and turned earth, she cried. Not from sadness, or at least not only from sadness, from relief, from exhaustion, from something that had no name but had been dammed up for 11 years. She let it pass. When she was done, she washed her face at the kitchen sink, made coffee on the wood stove that she had managed to light after 3 tries, and sat drinking it with her hands wrapped around the cup. A week after she had settled into the house, there was a knock at the front gate on a Saturday morning. Sarah opened it, expecting Mrs. Evelyn. It was Chloe. The young woman was carrying a backpack and had the look of someone who had walked quite a bit before arriving. She held a paper bag with the logo of a downtown bakery, and the aroma escaping from the bag was unmistakable. "I brought grilled cheese," Chloe said. "If you don't want company, I can leave it at the door and go." Sarah stared at her for a second. "Come in, Ray," she said. They had coffee on the porch that Sarah had cleaned, with the grilled cheese still warm on a folded towel on the wooden table. The silence between them was different from all previous silences. There was no tension in it, no defensive caution. It was the silence of 2 people who, for the first time, were simply present in a place without either of them needing to defend themselves from anything. "How's your mother?" Sarah asked finally. Chloe was silent for a moment. "She left here with Tyler," she said. "They went to where Tyler has some work contacts. I don't know their plans. My mother didn't talk to me before she left." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." I had already said goodbye to her before that. Chloe said with a clarity that wasn't coldness. It was just having reached a point. There are things you only see when you stop trying to be what others need you to be. Sarah nodded slowly. "Your father was a good man," Chloe said after a pause, looking at the garden. "He always treated me kindly, despite everything my mother did. I remember him letting me help take care of the plants here in the garden. He explained things with a patience my mother never had." Sarah looked out at the garden too. That was him. Patience like stone when he needed it. "I miss that," Chloe said, and there was a disarming honesty in that sentence that made Sarah turn to her. "You can help restore the garden if you want," Sarah said. "It's work, not a sightseeing trip. But if you're willing." Chloe looked at her with an expression that took a second to settle on her face, as if she needed a moment to process that she was being invited rather than tolerated. "I want to," she said simply. From that Saturday on, Chloe started showing up on weekends. She came early, left when the light began to fade without making a big scene of arrival or departure, just being there with a presence that was both useful and discreet. The 2 worked without needing to talk all the time, which is the mark of a companionship that truly serves. Mrs. Evelyn started coming 3 times a week, usually in the afternoon, when the heavier work was already done, and it was time for tea on the porch. Sometimes the old woman would bring Chloe into the conversation organically, telling stories about Sarah's mother that included the garden and the flowers and the way the flower beds had originally been arranged. It was her who had chosen to plant the pine trees along the edges of the road. Mrs. Evelyn recounted one of those afternoons. She said they were pretty and tough at the same time, that they didn't need much care and didn't complain about rain or drought. Sarah looked at the pine trees that still lined the entrance to the property, survivors of everything, pointed and sturdy. "She chose well," she said. The months passed with that consistency of someone rebuilding something brick by brick. Sarah hired a man from the state capital who knew masonry to fix the roof at the problem spots. She found an electrician who had done electrical work for other houses in the area and who charged a fair price after seeing the state of the wiring. She painted the interior walls with white lime wash, which is the kind of thing that transforms a space without needing much, bringing light into corners that had been dark for too many years. The garden was the longest work. Sarah had bought seedlings at the farmer's market, taken into account Mrs. Evelyn's stories about what had been planted originally, and began to restore the flower beds with a mix of what had been and what she wanted them to become. She reintroduced the basil and rosemary plants that were olfactory memories of childhood. She planted a lemon tree in the corner that her father had left empty for years without her knowing why, and that Mrs. Evelyn had revealed was the spot her mother had reserved for a fruit tree when she had time. One Saturday, when Chloe was helping her replant a flower bed along the wall on the right side, the young woman asked, head down and hands in the dirt, "Do you think about staying here for good?" Sarah stopped what she was doing for a second. "Yes," she said. "I'm still figuring out how. I have sewing clients in the small town, but I can make it work from here too, if I organize well." "The small town is smaller," Chloe said, "but maybe the quality of life is better. You stayed here." "I did." Chloe smiled a little the first time Sarah saw that smile come out without any reserve. "And sometimes I regret not leaving sooner to learn more things, but I'm here now, and it feels like where I was supposed to be." Sarah looked at the pine trees out front, at the mountains beyond, at the blue of the sky above the peaks. "It's like coming home," she said at last, more to herself than to Chloe. "Even when the house is different from how you remember it." The stepsister stayed quiet, but there was a silent agreement in that stillness that was answer enough. On a Tuesday morning, when Sarah was sewing near the living room window that had become her makeshift workspace, her cell phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. "Sarah Mitchell?" said a male voice that took her a second to place. It was Tyler. She hadn't expected this call. She held the phone for a moment before answering. "Yes," she said with a calm that took effort. "It's Tyler," he said unnecessarily. "I'm not going to call again after this, so you can relax. I just wanted to say one thing." Sarah waited. "What I did, the statement I gave to the clerk, wasn't just because I realized I was going to lose. It was because I spent years knowing I was wrong and didn't have the courage to say it. I'm not apologizing because I don't think an apology fixes anything here, but I wanted you to know." Silence. "I heard you," Sarah said finally. "Okay," he replied, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard from him before. An honest tiredness, without performance. "I hope you're well." The call ended. Sarah held the phone for a moment, looking out the window. The garden outside was recovering, the new plants growing slowly beside what had survived the neglect. A bird landed on the lowest branch of the newly planted lemon tree, stayed for a moment, then flew away. It wasn't forgiveness. She would still need time to get there. Or maybe forgiveness would never come in a named form, just as a gradual absence of the weight she had carried. But there was something in that call that closed a last door that had been left ajar. She went back to her sewing. The weeks that followed were the quietest Sarah had had in many years, perhaps in all the years since her father left. A new routine was settling in with the naturalness of things that are right. Early coffee, with a view of the garden. Sewing work in the morning with the good light from the east-facing window. Afternoons on the property tending to what needed care. And the end of the day on the back porch with the smell of earth and the sound of wind coming down from the mountains. Martha called from the boarding house on a Friday night to see how she was. "You're fine," the woman said, in that way she had of stating what didn't need to be said. "I can hear it in your voice." "I am," Sarah said. "I was getting used to not being fine, so it's strange, but I am." "Good. The little room here is still reserved in case you need a place." "Thank you, Martha." "Don't mention it. Go take care of your plants." Sarah laughed, and the laugh came out with a lightness she hadn't planned. It was the kind of lightness that doesn't come from pretending to be fine, but from actually being fine, with all the visible scratches and the tiredness still in the memory of her bones, but being fine. On a Saturday afternoon with strong sun, when Mrs. Evelyn was sitting on the wooden bench that had been rescued from the pantry and placed in the shade of the side wall, and Chloe was planting begonia seedlings in the flower bed by the entrance, and Sarah was whitewashing the front outer wall, the old woman said suddenly, looking up at the mountains, "Your mother would have loved to see this." Sarah stopped the brush for a second. "See what?" "Everything." Mrs. Evelyn said with a simplicity that held a world. "The house, you hear, Chloe planting flowers in the flower bed, the garden growing back. She would have loved it." Sarah looked at the garden, at Chloe kneeling in the dirt with her hands full of moss, at the pine trees by the entrance, at the mountains in the background with the Saturday sky over them. "Yeah," she said finally. "She would have loved it." She went back to whitewashing the wall. And it was there, in that simple gesture of brush on stone, with the smell of lime and the sound of the wind and the company of two people who had arrived by paths she hadn't chosen but had proven necessary, that Sarah realized the wound she had carried for 11 years hadn't closed with the will, nor with the meeting at the county clerk's office, nor with the cold keys in her hand. It had closed in that ordinary moment, with her feet on her father's land, with the white paint on her hands, with her mother's garden growing back in the background. That was what belonging was. You know it when it arrives. The end. This was a story that touched our hearts in a special way. Now tell us what you thought. Do you think Sarah was right to use the audio recording to fight for what was hers? Leave your opinion here in the comments. It really warms our hearts. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.